All right, Salam alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this special series. And it's a series that touches upon Palestine. It's a new approach. In other words, it's not just critiquing how bad things are and complaining, it's analyzing. It's looking into potential areas for change and looking at it from an American perspective. The United States is involved in so many crises throughout the world. This is probably the one issue where the United States is on the side. Well, let me just put it another way. It has the ability to change the situation more in Palestine than anywhere else in the world because of the financing, the military supplies to the state of Israel, and the political protection, the political cover it provides at the United Nations. So our tax dollars are involved directly on this issue involving the Palestinians, and in no other part of the world is it involved to such an extent. So we have a great series, as I'm sure most of you have seen the program covering the short history of Palestine and attempts at its erasure in Western culture, to the issue of war crimes. And that will be next week with Munal Khalil, who has worked at the United Nations and an expert on international law. We'll be talking about United States responsibility in terms of war crimes. And then we're going to hear perspectives from members of the Jewish community. David Myers, who's a professor of history at UCLA, will talk about history of Zionism. And I think it behooves us to hear that perspective. And after that, Jeremy Ben Ami and Peter Beinart will discuss a Jewish home versus a Jewish state, and where the thinking is changing there. Then after that, we'll be talking to Ken Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, which declared that what is happening in Palestine is apartheid. And then after that, we'll be looking at the nexus of anti-Palestine rhetoric and Islamophobia and its impact on the American Muslim identity with Sarah Tantawi, professor at Fordham University. So we have a great lineup, and I'm so excited that the lead off is Hussein Ibish. Hussein is a scholar in many ways. He has spoken at MPAC conventions in the past. At that time, I believe Hussein was the communications director for the ADC, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. He also served on the task force for Palestine. He writes for the American Task Force for Palestine and executive director of the Foundation for Arab American Leadership. He also writes for Bloomberg Opinion and The National. And he monitors, covers, and analyzes what's happening in Arab Gulf states as it relates to the region. So he is an expert, and we're very glad to have him. And we want him to talk about a short history of Palestine and attempts at its erasure in America. And we can talk about this dating back to, I believe, the words of Golda Meir when she came up with the phrase, "a land without a people for a people without a land," in terms of Jewish immigration to Palestine. So that we'll hand it off to Hussein Ibish to start off. And Hussein, thank you again for joining us. We're really honored and privileged to have you.
Oh, thank you, Salam. Good to be with you. You have a really great set of speakers coming up, so you could hardly have done better. So it's great to be part of that. I do appreciate it. I want to talk about the way Palestine and Palestinians have been perceived and not perceived in the United States, culturally and politically, in terms of our discourse here in the United States over time, and look at the themes that have characterized the way in which Palestinians have been characterized, caricatured, elided, erased, or papered over with some sort of, as I say, caricature over time. And because it's really interesting, although almost all of those deep-seated ideas are still prevalent. They can be found somewhere in our culture, right? They are not necessarily all operating with similar force that they used to have or that each other have, but they are all still out there. And then I think we should look a bit at the structures that have helped to create what is, in the end, a striking imbalance between the way Israel and Israelis have been perceived, understood, appreciated, sympathized with, empathized with, and ultimately therefore supported by Americans, and the way Palestinians have not been any of those things. Although, as you noted, there is some change going on right now. So I'll try to take you through a chronology here and link the development of the narrative of Palestine and the Palestinians in American culture with different phases in Palestinian history and the Palestinian-American relationship. I think that's the best way of doing it, and then end up looking at structures. So, initially, I think I'm not going to get into the fraught issue of when the Palestinians became Palestinians in a final irrevocable way. In other words, when Palestinians acquired a national identity that really finally distinguished them from the other Arabs of the Levant. I mean, I would say it's somewhere during the Mandate and above all the Nakba, the dispossession and displacement of the Palestinians, which affected all Palestinians, including those who stayed in northern Israel and the Galilee. Everybody experienced the destruction of that society. And that's an experience that's absolutely unique to Palestinians. But once that was experienced, I think there was no going back. You can trace the idea of the Arabs of Palestine having a particular consciousness and even to some extent national inklings, a national agenda to the late 19th century. And it's certainly, once the first pan-Arab state in Damascus fell to the French in 1922, I think it became increasingly clear to Palestinians that they were on their own, and that they were, whether they particularly wanted to be Palestinians, that's what they were going to be, or not. It didn't matter. That was necessary for their survival. But I think the outside world was much slower to perceive the emergence of a distinctive Palestinian people. And the first period of Palestinian history after the Nakba, I think, in other words, if we were to say in the United States there wasn't an appreciation of a Palestinian people, there was an understanding that there was a war in Palestine between Jews and Arabs, and that there was a conflict, and there was a debate in the UN, and there was an understanding that there were Arabs in Palestine, and they were part of the political process of the society under the Mandate, etc. But they were really never referred to as Palestinians, and there was very little understanding of who they were, very little interest. It was just the Arabs who happened to be there. During the period immediately after, so from 1948 to 1967, the only real image of Palestinians in the United States is and it wouldn't even have been called Palestinians. It would have been called the Arab, insofar as anyone knew of them, they would have been called the Arab refugees. I think there was more of a recognition of their existence in Britain because the British felt somewhat more directly responsible for the Nakba. But there was this trope that came about in the late 40s of the Arab refugees from Palestine, and they were just generally wherever there was an effort to raise money from the Arab refugees. That's really who people were talking about when they mention the Arab refugees. It's the first way of distinguishing the Palestinians from other Arabs, and so this gives us then the first two themes that we need to keep in mind. The first is that Palestinians have been unknown. So in the certainly before 1948, they were unknown, and even between 48 and 67, their existence was known, but their existence as a national society, as a people, as a movement, it was not known. And insofar as there was any discussion of them at all, which, as I say, was more common in Europe than in the United States, but did happen here sometimes among certain journalists and elites and whatnot. It was simply as generic refugees, and the refugees give Palestinians one of the tropes that hangs on them to this day, of a people who are simply displaced, pathetic victims. A people without agency, a people without, it's almost a subhuman status in the sense of people who are simply victims, but not victims of anything in particular, just happen to be suffering. And, probably it's their own fault or doesn't matter. The context is not important. The fact is there are these wretched people who live under terrible circumstances, good grief. And so I think there's very little about Palestinians in American discourse between 48 and 67, except in this form as refugees. So now you have the unknown function and the refugee trope. The refugee trope is not dead. It's definitely not dead. After 1967, between 1967 and 1973, 1967 was you get a new trope, which is the trope of the Palestinians as terrorists, right? This then becomes, the real sense that, okay, there are Palestinians. A couple of things happened during this period. Obviously, you have the founding of the PLO, and therefore in 1964 and its revivification in 1967 and 68 in the context of the occupation and the catastrophic 67 war with Israel. You have the emergence again onto the stage of world history of the Palestinian people, of the Palestinian national movement, with organizations and with a voice and an entity and whatnot. And 1967 was crucial in the United States because the ripple effects of how the conflict in Palestine impacted American culture was absolutely transformed in 1967. Right? Before the 67 war, there was generalized support for Israel, but it wasn't particularly strong. Israel's main backing foreign power was France. They got most of their weaponry from France. And in the United States, also, the Jewish community was pro-Israel, but in a very quiet way. They were still traumatized by the Holocaust, strong memories of the anti-Semitism of the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Is very pronounced anti-Semitism in the United States, a real fear of pushing Jewish influence in a parochial Jewish issue too far and causing a backlash. And I think there were some mixed feelings about Israel because Zionism had not become a hegemonic Jewish belief until 50s, 40s, 50s. It's certainly a post-Holocaust phenomenon. And, I think it took some time. It was 1967 war that was perceived almost messianically among not just Jewish Americans, but Americans in general, as a kind of redemption, as a kind of glorious conquest, a David versus Goliath, and also the reclamation by Jews of the entire supposed land of Israel, was seen. I think it inspired the imagination of a lot of Christians, especially evangelical Christians. It certainly changed the Jewish attitude towards Israel, where Israel became the main organizing force in Jewish civic society, in non-religious life, and even to some extent the defining issue of the Jewish community for a generation or two after 1967. So this sort of gives rise to a strong, aggressive American support for Israel, and a real campaign to cast the politically reborn Palestinians as a dangerous menace, as terrorists. It also, by the way, galvanized the beginning of the Arab American identity. I think before 1967, it didn't mean anything to say you were an Arab American. There were Egyptians and Lebanese and others, but mainly Lebanese, Syrians, etc. But then they really kind of functioned almost like Greek or Armenian Americans. The Muslim issue was a difference, but the community was much more skewed towards Arab American Christians at the time. The demographics have changed. And I think, before 1967, it was kind of an undifferentiated, hyphenated kind of almost Southern European, trans-Caucasian identity. For the Arab Americans, and no sense of themselves as a community. And 1967 shocked them into an awakening that they had a collective interest and they had a collective experience, and they needed to organize, particularly seeing the issue being so rapturously received by their fellow Americans. And so you get the birth of the first Arab American organizations, the Arab American University Graduates, which leads to then the creation of the first Arab American organizations, which sets the stage then for eventually the creation of the Muslim American political organizations as well. So it's a turning point in that sense as well. Culturally, as I say, you start to get the proliferation of aggressively pro-Israeli propaganda, anti-Palestinian propaganda in the United States. And it's when you see the issuing of the book, the Leon Uris book, Exodus, which defined the Israeli-Palestinian issue for a whole generation of Americans. It's extremely aggressive Israeli propaganda. It's been correctly said of that book that the only good Palestinian or Arab in it is a dead one, quite literally, and it is sort of an extremely it's a radicalized version of the Israeli narrative of the 1940s, and it was turned into a very popular film with Paul Newman. And it, I think, was extremely important in setting the stage for perceiving Palestinians as bad people who only brought their fate on themselves, and who, and it was the inklings of the idea that these are really terrorists, that these are really dangerous people and to be feared and mistrusted. Obviously, the terrorist theme remains a major problem to this day. But I mean, it's still in many senses one of the main things Americans think of many Americans think of when they think of Palestine and Palestinians. This got much worse after 1973, between 1973 and 82 and 67, and I'll explain the other bookend there for a second, you get a really aggressive Islamophobia and anti-Arab, not Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism in the American media. The oil shock of 1973, the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, and the oil embargo created an outpouring of anti-Arab sentiment in American popular culture, and it got linked to the Palestinians, got linked to Israel. The two main sort of caricatures of the villainous Arab got fixated in that period in the 1970s in American popular culture. One was the greedy, filthy, horrible, corrupt, avaricious, predatory oil sheikh, who is kind of a revivified version of the Jewish moneylender, kind of Shylock, and the bomb-throwing, crazy, radical Arab terrorist, probably a Palestinian, in most cases a Palestinian, who is a revivified version of the other anti-Semitic trope of the crazed bomb-throwing Jewish revolutionary. And this dominated. If you go back and look, it's hard to appreciate now, especially for younger people who were around in the 70s, but the extent to which American popular culture in the 70s and the 80s was dominated by these two tropes, these two kinds of villainous characters, is just remarkable. It was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. You know, the other thing that happens during this period after 1973, the heyday of the Hollywood anti-Arab agitation and anti-Palestinian agitation, and the creation of the Palestinian terrorists as an arch villain in American popular culture, is the birth of an evangelical narrative after the 1973 war, which you know, you still see this stuff today. There's a tendency on the part of some Christian evangelicals, and it's actually a very big community in the United States, who, not just the evangelicals who tend to do this, to take the Bible, especially the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation, and read them as if they were the A section of the New York Times. We do absolutely, literally, no metaphorical anything, no just and just literalizing it and trying to figure out who in the news represents which group of goodies or baddies in the books of the Old Testament, or the prophecies, the very vague prophecies of the, especially of the Book of Revelations. And there's been a constant set of narratives about how to read the present moment and immediate future of political history in the world through the Book of Revelations that has had a different arch villain. You know, it used to be the Soviet Union, then it was China, then it was Iran, then it doesn't matter who. Generally speaking, these stories tend to have the Battle of Armageddon and the fields of Megiddo, or in some way, there would be a giant conflagration between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and the children of light will defeat the children of darkness, and the second coming will come, and all of that stuff. And in that narrative, Israel becomes Israel as an extant entity. The fact of the existence of Israel becomes a major force for not moral good, but divine justice good, divine, you know, teleology, the realization of the divine plan for the cosmos. It couldn't be more important. And this is where you get the stuff that is often referred to as Christian evangelicalism, which is not. There is, you know, Christian Zionism, which is generally not Zionism. It generally doesn't. Zionism is about creating and maintaining a powerful, thriving Jewish state in all or part of historical Palestine. This is not about that. This is about ushering forth, helping to bring forward the giant war and conflagration that will lead to the wiping out of all people who are not just Christians, not the right kind of Christians, and the ruling of God on earth again. And it's a really kind of sort of divine genocide that's being yearned for here by many people. And this narrative begins in the 70s also. And it persists to this day. People talk about it all the time. So certainly you get at this point, you know, the real intensification of anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian themes in American culture. But things start to happen on the ground in the Middle East and get reflected in the news coverage in the United States that undermine that simple narrative of goodies, Israelis versus baddies, Palestinians and other Arabs. And the first big blow to this is the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacres. I mean, this was perceived as brutal, as disproportionate, as indefensible. A lot of Jewish dismay at this behavior, a lot of disquiet in Israel about the whole mission, and particularly the Sabra and Shatila massacre, a sense that Ariel Sharon had committed a huge war crime. And all of this really shifted the narrative. You suddenly saw Palestinians, Lebanese, and other Arabs as victims of Israeli brutality for the first time. And the narrative of Israel David versus the Arab Muslim Goliath became deeply problematized, to say the least, right? And then that was even more undermined by the first Intifada, which was, in 1987, which was a grassroots, popular uprising against occupation and the sort of system of brutal apartheid that Israel and colonialism that Israel does run in the occupied territories from people on the ground, without the leadership of the PLO directly in the beginning, because they were then exiled to Tunis after 1982, and before the emergence of Hamas, which happened during, but not prior to the first Intifada. So it was very spontaneous, and it was at the beginning and through most of it, almost entirely nonviolent, or violent in the sense of throwing stones or something that amounts basically to symbolic acts of violence. Certainly not nonviolent, but that is not a militarized conflict. Militarization starts to creep in at the end of the first Intifada, when the PLO is returning to the on the ground in the occupied territories, and you get the emergence of Hamas, and the thing becomes much more structured, organized, and you can see the origins of the militarized second Intifada. But most of the first Intifada was about Israeli troops beating, and under Rabin, who was the defense minister at the time in Israel, the policy for oppression was generally broken bones. So if a Palestinian protester, especially a rock thrower, was captured, troops were ordered to break their bones, break their arms or break their legs in order to incapacitate them and in order to punish them. And the brutality of this was remarkable. And it really, now we have the total flip of the David and Goliath narrative. It's not possible to look at the first Intifada, and Americans did. Americans who bother with the news did look at it, and see the Israelis as David, and these unarmed Palestinian youths with maybe rocks or not even rocks, as Goliath, and see them as terrorists and see them as anything else. They emerged for the first time as people with agency, with a cause, with a just cause, with as victims, but not passive victims like the refugees, like the big difference, but victims who are fighting for their rights and universal rights of freedom, of citizenship, of justice, of basically being able to live their lives like anybody else. This is a real turning point. I really think the first Intifada is the actual biggest turning point in American perceptions of Palestine and Palestinians, because doubts grew in '82. There were all kinds of mitigations and all kinds of ways of parsing it. 87 and 88, the first Intifada, there was no way around it. And for people who are willing to consider the reality, the new reality, it became obvious to them that the old narrative about Israel good, Palestinians bad, was not working. And the Palestinians as active freedom fighters emerged, not terrorists who say they're freedom fighters, not Arafat with a gun in the UN in Geneva, but kids with stones and people just wanting their freedom. That emerges for the first time, and that has had a tremendous impact on where we are today. In between '93 and 2000, you have then, I think, the emergence, '93 being the year of Oslo, right, post-Cold War, and the emergence of areas A, B, and C in the occupied territories, and the creation of the Palestinian Authority, and the so-called peace process, which has now died a tragic and ignominious death, really, at the hands mainly of Netanyahu, but all his other enablers on all sides. But he was never for it, and he has done it in so that his successors cannot revive it, for sure, at least in its current form. But it's really important, because with the Rose Garden signing ceremony between Arafat and Rabin, the creation of a full-fledged US diplomatic relationship with the PLO, a PLO mission in Washington that had achieved, until Trump shut it down and threw it out, the status of an embassy, right? You had then the creation of an image of the Palestinians as not just a people and a cause, but a national movement with a respectable leadership that could be dealt with at a diplomatic register, a people who can sign treaties, a people who are there at the UN, not making angry speeches, but participating as a non-member observer state, which every state that was a non-member observer state that wants to be a member state has become one, either on its own or through unification, like East Germany and West Germany, and North and South Vietnam, and that kind of stuff. It's very hard to keep anyone who doesn't want to go from being a non-member observer state to, out of being a member eventually. So it's a really important change also, because then you get the notion of Palestinian leaders in the White House, the Palestinian president, the Palestinian ambassador, so really, really, I think very, very important. That was built on some of the work we did at the task force in the 2000s. What we were trying to do, among other things, was to mainstream the idea of Palestine and Palestinians in Washington society, in Washington discourse, and the respectable people, even big supporters of Israel, would come to a Palestinian American gala with the Secretary of State, or even maybe we came close a couple times. We didn't get the president, but we came awful close twice. Speaking that would begin with everyone standing up for Mawtini and the Palestinian national anthem, and be all about a celebration of Palestine, Palestinians, Palestinian Palestinian Americans and their contributions, that sort of stuff. And I think this is something that only concerns the bubble in Washington, what people deride as the blob, the policy framing community. The people here in the think tanks and the political organizations, the lobbyists, the foreign policy experts, and the people who are in that rotating circle in and out of government jobs, all came. And that I think did have a big impact. It's my bias. I was part of it, but it did change something in that little but all important area. But then you get the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada was disastrous for the reputation of Palestinians because of the suicide bombing and the way it was perceived. It was perceived, and Palestinians, it's perceived very negatively in the United States, to say the least. And it was especially problematic that 9/11 was an instance of suicide terrorism in the United States. It became possible to try to cast Palestinians as, again, back as the vicious terrorists, as the people who just want to take lives, and then as the precursors to the 9/11 attack. Even though there are no Palestinians involved in 9/11, very few Palestinians playing any role in Al-Qaeda, although there was some predecessors, but very few, especially because of their nationalism. But that gets into a sort of a depth that Americans didn't experience. They saw Palestinian suicide terrorism in the occupied territories and in Israel, and then they saw it here in the United States, and they made the connection. And there was this footage, which those of you who were around at the time will remember, of a tiny group of people supposedly dancing in the West Bank. No one was ever able to authenticate it or trace it, and being happy. And then some shopkeeper offering a cameraman some sweets. And it was all not clear what it was, where this came from or what it was. And, the pro-Israel voices in the United States went crazy on those videos, saying, you see these people, they love that attack on the United States, they hate us, their Al-Qaeda is just a pro-Palestinian thing, or this is the root of it all, or something like that, right? And that was really, really very damaging. So the post 9/11 shift was really bad for Palestinians in the United States, because you had a shift away from anti-Arab stereotypes, which often focused on Palestinians, to a much more vicious kind of Islamophobia. In other words, the target went from an ethnicity to a religious group, and it became much more vicious. And Palestinians were often portrayed, or the cause of Palestine, as the ultimate form of Muslim viciousness, irrationality, badness, etc., like that. And the other thing is, and this is really worse in a way, the media shifted from the entertainment industry to the news media, so that it was no longer necessary to make a movie like Exodus or a movie like, The Siege or something to be or all the Golan Globus films of the 80s, these Israeli movies that used to come out in the United States. It wasn't necessary to make those. You could just go on TV, go on CNN or Fox or anything, and say flat out, these are bad people. And these are the terrorists, and it's all down to Islam, and the worst of them are the Palestinians, and the worst of them love the Palestinians, and just mix the whole thing up in a kind of giant ball. And that, I think, did a great deal of harm. So you got then the revivification of the theme of terrorists, but greatly intensified, right? Greatly seen not as a cartoonish villain, but as a real threat, and a threat not to people over there, a threat to us Americans because they hate us for who we are and all that stuff. You also get the rise of discourse about the PLO and the PA as corrupt and despotic and dysfunctional and incompetent. And you could make the case that it is all those things. But the point is, you get, Palestinians are seen as kind of now being painted because things are not good in the occupied territories, even in Area A, as if they had, a lot of authority. But that is often sort of pointed out directly or indirectly as evidence that Palestinians are really not fit to run their societies and have to prove. People are still willing to say they have to prove that they can be peaceful and friendly and effective and good governance and all of that. So it comes out of this period, certainly. The idea of the Palestinian as a brainwashed fanatic, right, an unthinking agent of violence and chaos is there in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but it really becomes much more pronounced after the Second Intifada, and it's more dangerous when that comes out in news analysis form or in debate, rather than encoded in a movie. And I think that's what you get after the 9/11, the Second Intifada and 9/11, which kind of mix together. But at the same time, I think what we've seen is since 2016. In the Trump era, there has been a flowering of the seeds that were sown in 1982 and especially in 1987 of viewing the Palestinians through a different narrative, a narrative of racism and colonialism, a narrative of sympathy, empathy, of full humanity, and of seeing them as the latest victims of a history of the abuse of non-white people by white people, the identification of Israelis, fairly or unfairly, as just another European colonial movement, another settler state, and the Palestinians as their brown victims right now. It used to be the case. The Israeli government and their friends and Zionists and their allies had spent a lot of time in the 50s, especially in the 60s, 70s, 80s, creating a kind of conflation of Israel and Israelis and Americans in the United States, and kind of presenting Israel as a pioneer state fighting nature and the savages to create a great country against the wishes of these barbaric people, et cetera, et cetera. And that had helped them for a long time. But now in the sort of era of progressive, and as its critics would call it, woke progressivism, which is very strong on identity and very strong, maybe even too strong, on totalizing narratives and analogies, Palestinians emerge as the heroes for the first time. The Palestinian narrative of history has a deep-seated mainstream cultural resonance in the United States on the progressive left for the first time. You used to have, people on the far right, David Duke, who were sort of pretending to be pro-Palestinian. They were really just looking for a way of being anti-Semitic. This is genuinely pro-Palestinian without being anti-Semitic. I think sometimes it can bleed into that, but for the most part, it's not that at all. And that's a very new way of looking at things. And it is partly the result of an accumulation of impressions that began in 82 and 87. It's partly the result of a lot of hard work on the part of activists for decades to tell this story of Palestinians and their friends. It's partly the result of a new generation of Americans and Jewish Americans rethinking their perception of these issues. It's partly a result of Israel's, the outrageousness of Israel's conduct during the occupation, of pretending to want to make a two-state agreement, and then, like Lucy with the football, pulling it away every time. No. And people they come to understand what's going on. You can't fool them for that long. So I do think there is a greater understanding now, and you can see in the polls. I don't think it helps Palestinians much for the metric that poll watchers tend to go to is, who do you sympathize with more, Israelis or Palestinians? I mean, that doesn't really matter in terms of policy, and it's sort of a silly question, in a way. But I think it does give us a sense of where the culture is going. And I think one of the few things that the right says that is true is culture is downstream from politics. They love to say that. Politics is downstream from culture, forgive me. Cultural changes really do have a big impact in the long run on policy. I was going to talk about the structures that allowed news reporting to be so biased for so long. They're interesting, but they're not as interesting as this little story that I've told you about American perceptions of Palestine. And the erasure of Palestine is more complete than ever on the ground, right? The prospect of a Palestine, an independent Palestine, anywhere meaningful, I don't know, maybe the Emirate of Gaza or something, but no, something serious in the occupied territories is further away than ever. But the comprehension of Palestine as a real and existing place, thing, cause, people, truth in the American culture is stronger than ever. There's an irony for you. And that's where we are today. All the themes that I talked about, the unknown Palestinian, the pathetic refugee, the generic Arab with all the bad Arab traits, the generic Muslim with all the generic Islamophobic attributed traits, especially terrorism, the corrupt and despotic Oriental, the brainwashed, unthinking automaton, and now the victim of racism and colonialism. All of those are there still to this day in our culture. And that's basically the soup, the bubbling, frothy soup that makes up this little tale, in my view. I'm going to stop here.
Fascinating. I would like to hear more about your analysis of news media, but
sure.
If you want to take 5 more minutes to do that, go right ahead. But
okay, I will mention it.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's worth saying, because I think that for a long time Americans were, and even to this day, Americans are very well exposed to the Israeli, not just the Israeli narrative, but Israeli experience. When things happen in Israel, they're very well reported on by the American news, and they're much discussed. One of the reasons is there is a very strong and powerful Jewish and now Christian evangelical set of voices, set of cultural forces that are attuned to those experiences and amplify them in the United States. So that's the first thing. And you haven't had that. Now, increasingly, it does happen in the United States on behalf of Palestinians, but historically, it's been very strong. The Israeli experience has been not just the narrative, but the daily experience. If something bad happens in Israel, Americans hear about it, and they hear about it in detail, and they hear about it right away, and they hear about it in a personalized manner. It's not, 5 people got killed when a bomb. No, this is the name of that child, and this woman was going to, and the ironies and the sadness and the tragedy, and they would hear all about that, which is great, but it was very one-sided. And that's increasingly less the case, still true, but much less the case. Every time there is a bombardment of Gaza, I think there's more and more appreciation in the United States of the toll that ordinary Palestinians are taking. Whatever people think of Hamas is another story, but the killing of these people, the destruction of this property is covered in a way that reflects more of an appreciation of the experience. You see that from the New York Times. These videos, about which I'm sure you're aware of if you follow this issue carefully, that the New York Times did, tracing a series of bombing strikes by Israel in Gaza in the last spasm of violence a few weeks ago really annoyed Israelis, and Israelis who don't usually go in for crude hasbara anymore, crude propaganda. People who try to play it straight most of the time were moved to really complain bitterly and say, oh, no, really kick up a fuss, because they knew a nerve was being struck here. The New York Times article with the picture of all the dead children from the conflict on the front page of the New York Times, that caused howls of outrage from people, again, who usually try to contain their role as a propagandist. I think there's a very powerful Israeli state propaganda media, and nothing similar on the Palestinian side. Palestinians have been, not Palestinian Americans so much, but the PLO and other Palestinian institutions have been inept at messaging, I think, generally, at least messaging to Americans. And then finally, there's this, which is American journalists in the region have been based in West Jerusalem. So they've lived as Israelis. They've lived Israeli lives. Access to Israel and Israelis is easy and quick and simple. And to Palestine and Palestinians is not so much. And that skews things as well. There's much more, but I'll stop at that.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about, the campaign to make, to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And silencing those of us who are vocal about the issue and its impact on trying to erase more of this Palestinian existence.
Yeah, I mean, what it does is it stigmatizes a very common, natural perception. I mean, in other words, look, we don't have a narrative yet to easily marry the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative. So if you if you invest emotionally in the Palestinian narrative, your impulse is going to be an anti-Zionist, right? That is going to be a natural response to a legitimate fact-based narrative about real experiences. And to stigmatize that as being primarily either an intention or in effect the negation of another people really sort of bars the basic building blocks of Palestinian national identity and sympathy for it. I will say, so it's a kind of erasure in that sense. It basically says, don't go there. Don't go into that space, because you will be doing something immoral. And I don't think we can allow people to bully us into that. I do think this, though. I think also it requires enormous vigilance to make sure that anything that does smack of anti-Semitism, and you see it, it's not BDS, it's not calling for boycott, that's not anti-Semitism, but anything that tends to stigmatize Jews or even all Israelis as somehow tainted is very dangerous. And it's a powerful weapon. It's used all the time because it's a powerful weapon. The only way to defang it is to do two things simultaneously: to expose its fallacy and the intention of simply barring any real engagement with the Palestinian experience and narrative, and at the same time being very clear about what you won't accept people to say in the course of supposedly supporting Palestine and Palestinians, because there's a lot of bad stuff out there.
The other issues, the line that many Israeli pro-Israel groups use and Israeli officials use in the media, that as they're bombing Gaza, they're saying, well, it's all about Hamas trying to destroy Israel,
yep,
not accepting Israel's right to exist. Where do you see that issue?
Well, it's not working that well, because even people who say, yeah, we don't really like Hamas, or we think that Hamas didn't have to intervene in the violence in Jerusalem, or who think it was a bad idea, or who have problems with Hamas's agenda. It doesn't matter what you think of Hamas. That this was disproportionate is undeniable. That it was well, I mean, whether it was discriminate or indiscriminate, this guy from UNRWA got in a lot of trouble for saying that he didn't think it was terribly indiscriminate, right? But what people missed is he wasn't saying it wasn't disproportionate. He wasn't saying it wasn't cruel and deliberately kind of mass punishment. He was saying that generally the rockets fell where they wanted them to fall. That was not actually a nice thing to say about the Israelis, because a lot of places were bombed that shouldn't, certainly, even if you accept that logic that, oh, you know, this is a self-defensive thing, which I think is very, I mean, it's easily debunked. But the more to the point is that the Israelis themselves have talked about the need to make people of Gaza pay a price for what Hamas does. They have talked about conflating the Palestinian civilians, most of them refugees in Gaza, with Hamas, making no difference between the two. And especially they have said, and this is where it's been most open, is that we need to target the Gaza elite who are not with Hamas, but who have some money and some businesses and things. We need to blow up their buildings. We need to blow up their homes. We need to blow up their businesses. So that puts pressure on Hamas not to annoy us or provoke us or do anything we don't like. And it really is impossible to justify this. So I think but it's Hamas argument. The main effect of it was to get the Gulf countries, UAE and Bahrain, off the hook, because they were squirming and suffering about the violence in Al-Aqsa and in Sheikh Jarrah, and they were having a very hard time with that. They were issuing statements. Once it became that they could say, you know, to their people, oh, but this is Hamas versus Netanyahu, they're all nuts. You know, it became a sort of dodge for them. But I think in the United States, it doesn't play in the public well at all anymore. People have heard that story. And as the New York Times coverage indicated, it wasn't working.
I find it fascinating the way you explain that on the ground it's getting worse. We see the erasure, but the comprehension of Palestine in America is actually getting stronger.
Much stronger.
Is there enough time to catch up to reverse what's happening on the ground?
Reverse it? No, I don't think it can be reversed. Here's the thing about reality. Reality keeps changing. Right? Things keep happening. Nothing stays the same. So that means that things can either stay the way they are, you know, the relative proportion of good and bad can stay the way it is, or they can get worse, or they can get better. There are lots of ways they can get better, right? We used to want Arabs and Palestinians for decades dreamed of reversing 1948 and recreating the Palestinian society that existed before the Nakba. It became obvious that wasn't going to happen. Then there was a dream of the Palestinian state, and that now seems a distant dream. There are people who dream of a single united democratic state. Lovely, it seems very far off. But the point is, I think at this point, we don't know what exactly the framework for liberation and freedom is going to look like. I don't know anyone who knows what it's going to look like. But I also think very few sensible people look at this situation and say, oh yeah, this will work. This is nice and stable. This is tenable. This is a perfectly workable relationship. This arrangement, this is fine. I don't know anyone sensible who thinks that. So you can go, I mean, you can keep the ball in the air for a while. And it probably will stay in the air for a while, but eventually we're either going to move towards some new model of coexistence, whatever it's going to be. It probably won't look like too much else that we've seen in the world. Probably going to have to be a sui generis answer for a sui generis conflict. Or the other big fear I have is that there is a de facto unilateral Israeli solution, which is the imposition of new borders that are supposedly final borders that involves ethnic cleansing for a third time. We had it in 1947-48. We had it in 1967. 15, 20 years ago, I would have said you can't get away with that anymore. But surely now you can. I mean, we live in a very anarchic world, more anarchic than during the Cold War. Now there's an opportunity to do stuff that is very outrageous, and people are not going to intervene. So I think that is the other direction we could go in, and it's a very ugly one. And there's I think that the thing to do is to, yes, we can all work together to make things better and make sure that the change is in a positive and not in a negative direction. What the plan, the big plan, I can't tell you because I can't think of anyone where this is a straight line from here to there. In any event, there would be multiple phases, and I don't know anyone who is prescient enough to understand where exactly we're going. I certainly think it's easy to tell what you shouldn't do. But much harder to know where we're going. What you should do is also not hard to tell, but where it's going to take us is a little bit more murky.
We have a few questions from our audience, and anyone else would like to ask a question, just go ahead and type it in your in the chat space. First question deals with moving the needle in DC. And, you know, Hussein, we meet a lot of people and they understand the Palestinian issue, and staffers of members of Congress and staffers of the White House and the State Department, they get it and they know what's going on. Yet the ones who speak at the podium, they're reading a script.
Yes.
But you're talking about progressives changing the narrative.
Yeah.
Do you see it? Do you see this shifting in terms of the narrative?
Yeah, it is shifting. Okay, it is shifting. It's not, maybe I think a lot of people aren't aware of it because they don't look at it as in as granular a fashion. It's shifting in both directions. It's shifting in a very bad way and it's shifting in a very good way. There was since, you know, from the founding of the Israeli state, there were a series of consensus positions on Israel that united most Democrats and most Republicans. There was an isolationist wing of the Republican Party in the 50s and 60s that didn't want to have anything to do with, you know, foreign countries, including the Israelis. There, some people left enough to have doubts, but in the main, between 48 and 67, there was kind of, you know, guarded support for Israel, but a willingness to intervene in 1956 and say, no, you go back to Israel and get out of Sinai. You know, it wasn't this unthinking lockstep cooperation. From 67 until, you know, sort of the end of the Cold War, there was this notion of supporting Israel, but increasingly seeing that Israel would benefit from the creation of, and the United States would benefit from the creation of a Palestinian state in the occupied territory. So support for an Israel-based two-state solution, this is the crucial thing, right? The US support for a two-state solution was always mainly a function of a pro-Israel orientation. Right? It wasn't a pro-Palestine orientation. It was a pro-Israel orientation. It was a way Americans, most American politicians understood Israel's best interests under the guidance of various Israeli thinkers and some politicians, but mostly, you know, commentators. Anyway, the point is, there was a real consensus for that. And it's in the Trump era that we've seen the breaking of that third consensus, which, you know, was very long lasting. And on the right, you have this evangelical driven support for annexation, for greater Israel, absolute rejection of Palestinian statehood, and real embrace of the most extreme vision of the settlers. I don't know how you reach those constituencies, how you reach the America Firsters, who are kind of like religious neoconservatives on steroids. I really am not sure how to reach them. There is this core of two-staters in the center, people like the Republicans in the Senate, most of them, and Biden and the people immediately around him, who would like to somehow revive a two-state solution, but they don't know how because it's not really possible, given especially after Trump. And then on the left, you have voices that are pushing the whole Democratic Party to the left on this issue and to a greater appreciation of the Palestinian cause. So you had voices of the progressive left, people like AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and others, even Bernie Sanders in a very attenuated way, speaking out, you know, really questioning the idea that this is a legitimate self-defense by Israel during the last bombardment of Gaza. But you had also, and this is a crucial thing, you had die-hard pro-Israel Democrats, die-hard ones, issuing statements that, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself, yes, but we're very concerned about the loss of life. We're very concerned about Sheikh Jarrah. We're very concerned about the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We're very bothered by these. I mean, these are statements you could never have imagined. Bob Menendez signing, and he did. Jerry Nadler and Chuck Schumer signing, and they did. These are not random these are not random Democrats. These are Israel's strongest backers. And something has happened in the party. The progressive left and the way in which the Republicans have gone evangelical Greater Israel annexationists have combined to squeeze that Democratic center into a more into a position where they're much more willing to criticize Israeli policies within certain reason. And if that continues, there's going to be a lot of change over time.
Another question from our audience. What advice do you have for reaching the hearts and minds of evangelical Christians, especially?
I'm the wrong person.
I know.
I don't know.
But they're
I
saying
don't know.
This person has family members who are evangelical.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I guess you'd have to use your own scriptures. I really don't know. I'm not good at convincing very devout people of things because I don't have the toolkit, the scriptural toolkit. They're not going to listen to my political arguments.
Right. No,
That's for sure.
I don't think they'll listen to anyone.
Well, maybe not. Indeed, they may not. But they might be moved by human stories. But, the problem is, as they say, with God, all things are possible. The flip side is with God, all things can be permissible. Mm-hmm. Because if it's all part of a divine plan, who are we to judge? And that can be very dangerous.
Yes, that is. A question regarding, you monitor the Gulf.
I do.
And you follow events there very closely.
Yes, I do.
In terms of what Bahrain and UAE did, isn't that part of also erasing Palestinian existence because they signed an accord that really had nothing to do with Palestinians?
No, I don't think so. I think it has to do with. I think it had to do with shattering the Palestinian strategy, which is bad enough. I don't think it does anything to erase Palestine particularly. I mean, the fact is Israel is not going anywhere. So you can either deal with it covertly, or you can deal with it as a matter of undeniable need, like the Jordanians and the Egyptians, or you can try not to deal with it. But I think a country like the UAE is so bound up in regional affairs. They're going to be dealing with it. Saudi Arabia deals with Israel covertly. Turkey deals with it overtly, but then they have this pattern of angry talk, but it's all talk because if you look at the trade and the military links, they're very robust. So, I mean, it's a reality in a very finely balanced strategic region, and people are going to deal with it one way or the other. I think, and I don't buy the line that they had done anything to help the Palestinians by preventing annexation, right? Actually help Trump and the Israelis. This was the rationale of the UAE, that this saves the Arab Peace Initiative, and I'll explain what I mean, and saves the prospect of the two-state solution. It sounds good, but it's not right. They were looking for an opportunity to do this. They'd been looking for 2 years for an opportunity to do it, and then they found one and they did it. Now, I think it's them operating strictly in their own national interest, right? Now, they have many good reasons for doing this. They have, I calculated one time, 11 or 12 rational reasons that they would do this. Bahrain has one, they're scared of Iran. But the UAE has a bunch of reasons for it. Now, what it does that's so bad to the Palestinians is it exposes the failure of the leadership really brutally. Because after the peace process finally fell apart, which was the last gasp of it was in the first Obama term, when Obama demanded using the roadmap that had been constructed by the Middle East Quartet under Bush, he said, we'll implement phase 1 of the roadmap. And the first thing Israel has to do is a total settlement freeze. And he demanded it. So the Palestinians demanded it. I was on really good terms with the Palestinian leadership at the time. And we were all telling them, don't make this a cornerstone, give yourself an out, give yourself a back door. So because the Americans are not going to be able to get the Israelis to do this. They could, but Obama is not going to pay the price. He's not going to spend the political capital. He convinced Netanyahu to do this. It's going to be really hard. And he's not going to want to do it. So it's not going to happen. So don't put yourself in that corner, but they did. Okay, why should they listen to us? And they didn't. But I mean, it was good advice. The point is, after that, there was no way back. And there hasn't been a way back, especially since Netanyahu doesn't want a way back. Now, in lieu of that, what did the PLO and leading Palestinian representatives and officials say, diplomats and others, say was their national strategy? In second Obama term and going into, into Trump and all that, it was the API, the Arab Peace Initiative that was introduced by Saudi Arabia in 2002, which basically made a link between recognition of Israel and ending the occupation, right? And it was structured so that the collective Arab recognition of Israel was a sweetener to come at the end of a successful two-state solution agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, it was fine insofar as it went, but the big problem was when it became the Palestinian national strategy, de facto. Right? When you ask these Palestinian leaders, what's your national strategy? Behind closed doors, down and dirty, right? What are you guys doing? They would either say the Arab Peace Initiative, or they would describe the Arab Peace Initiative without using those three words. Right? And so I'm thinking to myself, man, that's really risky. It's really risky to put your national strategy in the hands of lots of other countries that have their own interests and may redefine it, may not abandon it, but they'll redefine it in a way that's not useful to you. And that's exactly what happened with the UAE. So basically, I think in a way it's disastrous, but also it's an opportunity for the Palestinians in the sense that they were using the API, which didn't really function, as a substitute for a national strategy. And now they don't have a national strategy. They need to get one. The problem is, to get a national strategy, you need a national leadership. And right now, they don't have a strong consensus national leadership. There is a guy who is the mayor of Ramallah, who calls himself the president of Palestine, but he's the mayor of Ramallah. And there's Hamas in Gaza, however you want to characterize them, that's fine. But neither of them are functional national leaderships. And therefore, there's no national strategy. And that makes progress at a diplomatic level almost impossible. And, so in that sense, it may have been a painful amputation that was necessary, because this was all going to blow up at some point. There's something fraudulent about the whole thing, and it's probably good to break the illusion.
We've really taken a lot of your time, but I have one last question.
I'm happy to stay.
Yeah. You and I have been working in Washington for so long, and we know that Arab Americans need not apply for policy positions in the government, especially in the State Department. However, there was a minor change that I don't know if it was tectonic or it was just throwing us a bone, but the appointment of Hadi Amr as President Biden's envoy on this issue. How do you interpret that move?
It's not tectonic. It's more gradualism on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, there's still a big sign saying Arabs need not apply. On the Democratic side, there is a sign saying Arabs need not apply for senior jobs. But what Hadi got, Hadi, I should say, is a really great Arab American development official, basically. Comes out of USAID, which is the development appendage of the State Department. So he's an American diplomat, in effect. But yeah, I mean, he's a mid-level diplomat. He's not a very senior guy. He could be. I mean, look, if Jared Kushner can be, David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt can be bumped up. Anyone, I mean, it's just your friend the mailman could be, no problem. But we're back in an administration that values regular order and works through the system as it is. So he could be empowered, but it would be very weird if he were. Okay, it is important that an Arab American is carrying the portfolio, but it's problematic that the portfolio is small. In other words, by appointing Hadi, you put an Arab American in. This is great. But by appointing Hadi, you put a development guy in, which means it's a development project, which means it's all about aid and all about the restoration of the level. It's going to be, I mean, I've looked at the program in detail. They want to get back to about $900 million a year to not to the PA, because of this Taylor Force Act that was passed during Trump. They really can't give money direct to the PA. That's not that big a problem, because you can fund things and groups that are doing stuff in Palestine that's helpful to people in hospitals and schools, and that's all fine. That's fine. So they're going to do that. But ultimately, if you want to take it further, you would need to either empower him or you'd need someone more senior. The other thing is there are now increasingly Arab Americans in other lower level positions, but not, junior ones, mid-level positions. I mean, I know 3 serious Arab Americans who are waiting for jobs, who are turning down speaking engagements because they're waiting for jobs, and they're real jobs. They're policy jobs. Mm-hmm. So it's not a closed door. It's a closed door at the most senior level. All of this, I mean, it's still the case that the Arab Americans and the American Muslims have not organized themselves politically sufficiently. And you need that in the American system. You need a bunch of either money or voters to move this stuff. This is the First Amendment. Maybe in a way is the most important part of it, is the most overlooked part. The right to petition the government for the redress of grievances. Mm-hmm. That means this government is set up to be lobbied. That means votes and money will move it. Mm-hmm. And if you come to the table with good ideas and brilliance and insight and good intentions and everyone loves you, and you got no votes and no money, that's lovely. And they'll do what Colin Powell did when he was Secretary of State, and he came and met with us when I was at ADC, and we talked to him, and he said, this was during the Second Intifada, before 9/11. And he said, I agree with 90%, 85% of what you've told me, but I don't have political cover to get you almost any of that. You got to get us political cover.
Right.
This is an honest, truthful statement.
Yeah. Same thing happened in the situation in Bosnia. We went and spoke to the NSC, and they said, yeah, we agree with you now. Where are your constituents?
Yeah.
How are you going to force us to do it?
Where's the leverage? Where's the leverage? Where's my, you could do, where's the leverage? How do you lift me up? What Powell was using was the analogy of cover. How am I defending myself?
What happened to the American Task Force for Palestine?
We were set up, we operated for 10 years. We were set up with the goal of making a 2-state solution and end to the occupation a priority for American foreign policy. Priority means one of the top 3 or 4 issues. Otherwise, it just can't be done. And I think we made headway on the goal of mainstreaming the words Palestine and Palestinian and the concept of Palestine in Washington power circles. That was successful. But in terms of prioritizing the policy, it did get prioritized, but not because of us, right? And we didn't really, I mean, we were useful in carrying messages and being people, whatever, but we played a role. But it happened because Bush second term and Obama first term wanted to get into it, right? For whatever reason, they both engaged in it. Okay. By the time Obama's second term was well underway, it became really clear that there was no immediate prospect for making this a priority. John Kerry was basically told, you want to do this, you're on your own. I think it's ridiculous. And it was very hard to imagine either Hillary or Trump or any other Republican or Democrat changing their minds. And indeed, Biden has not. Biden wants to make this a back burner issue too, right? That the big lesson of all of this that American politicians have taken away is this is a big losing issue, which is really tragic. So what we could have done, we had developed a system there to sustain ourselves at our current level. We could have kept going, but it would have meant raising about $1 million a year for all of our expenses to pursue a mission that was not going to happen. So we thought, you know what, we can always reform if the issue becomes relevant again. But we tasked ourselves with a very narrow task that was no longer plausible. Move on. Don't bang your head on the wall. Don't move on, do something else. Yeah. That's what we did. We're not a social services. There's a lot of important work to do in the West Bank on the ground. We had no apparatus to do it. There's education work in the United States, no apparatus to do it. Lobbying work, we're not a lobbying group. We were just there to talk to the policy community. And if it couldn't possibly get into the top 3 or 4 or 5 issues, there's no point. If we know we're going to fail, why would we try? And we didn't. Plus, people can spend their money better than giving us money for salaries for a failed project. I would have felt bad asking people to donate to a mission, a doomed mission.
Well, I'm sure that we'll find you involved in more impactful and
well, I never stopped writing about Palestine. I never stopped advocating and talking about it, even though I, now write these columns and I work for a Gulf-oriented think tank and all that. I won't let the issue go. I can't let the issue go, and that's never going to happen.
Well, we thank you for that, and we thank you for, if everybody else can join me, I'm going to put my applause emoji on my screen. Everybody else, please give a warm round of applause for Hussein Ibish, this outstanding, eye-opening history of I think you called it the characterization.
Yeah.
Characterization of the Palestinian, and I think that's a class in and of itself. You gave us a wonderful class, a wonderful way of leading our lecture series, and you've been great, and I hope to see you in Washington. And
I look forward to it, Salam. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Next week, we'll be talking about war crimes. Is the United States culpable? And where does international law stand in terms of that culpability? That'll be next week. Hope to see you then. Thank you very much. Salam alaikum.